I'm sure you will all agree that few community training and research issues are more important than the protection and support of children, reducing their risk factors, promoting mental health and physical health, and increasing creative opportunities for learning, and I underline here creative opportunities for learning, and school achievement. Yet only a few years ago, we were pursuing these goals in fragmented ways rather than in systematic, theory and research-based and policy-focused ways. Well, now we are at a different place, and we are beginning to address all of these issues, the needs of Boston children and children in the greater Boston areas, through a high institutional level. We're doing it collaboratively, and I think all of you who are here today represent many institutions, both locally and nationally, and show that we have made good progress in collaborating, building a solid research base in such a way as to inform and mold policy and best practices. We have an incredible opportunity before us, namely to combine Boston's community development possibilities and networks, a strong and committed mayor, Thomas Menino, with Harvard's scholarly and intellectual, and I might add financial resources. I knew I had to say that. Well, 5 years, $5 million. That's not bad. I wasn't paid to say this. We have a president at Harvard. Oh gosh, I shouldn't have brought this up. We have a president committed to education and public health. Under these conditions, we assembled here today for the second Learning with Excitement conference, and it will be, I assure you, a dynamic day and dynamic force in really making progress in developing a common language and to shape the field. We are very much in need of the shaping of the field, and I think it's a very exciting time to be able to do this. Our partnership goals are ambitious because we want to combine local experiences and best practices with a national agenda of scholarship, thereby leading the way in connecting researchers, policymakers, and practitioners and bringing them together. The program in after-school education and research works closely to reach these goals with Chris Gabrielli and the Boston After School for All Partnership, a partnership that was established by the mayor. Philip Brooks House and its leader, Judith Kidd, who is here today, and the Harvard After School Initiative, Kevin McCluskey, Jane Corlett, Paige Lewin, under the leadership of Ellen Stone. We also work closely with local and national partners, and many of you are here today. I want to thank Robert and Marjorie Kargman for their support of this conference and the 5-year plan to create a national learning community. Bob, you're over here. Because these must be ongoing for confluence between scholarship policy and practice, I asked Mayor Menino and President Summers to give us their thoughts today to inform us on their key questions and to tell us how we can best help them make policy decisions for the future. They don't have a lot of time to actually go into it in depth, but even some ideas that will help shape the day is what we wanted from them, a charge for the day. And with this, I would like to turn to the mayor and briefly introduce him. I've lived in great... I should start? Well, I'm following...
You're in Cambridge now, Tom.
Oh. Remember he said that for all these people, huh? You own more property in Boston.
When we're in Boston, I'm part of the build-up to you.
Now, what should I do, audience? I think I'm going to stay with the protocol. I've lived in Boston for over 30 years, and although Thomas Menino has been mayor for only a portion of that time, Boston is associated, in my mind, with his leadership. I see the mayor and hear him speak at so many conferences and events dealing with education and after school, and each time my admiration only rises for this man who has shown such great commitment to education and safety, health and mental health of Boston's youth and families. Constant engagement with the most basic education and safety issues is, in fact, I believe, the mayor's signature. I'm sure that one day we will all view these years as incredibly important ones because under Mayor Menino, under his leadership, we've gone beyond thinking and planning and have taken many concrete steps towards protecting our youth and making sure that we have given them the best possibilities and opportunities for learning. The fact that we're here together representing many diverse after schools, universities, and clinics and working towards the same goal is in large part thanks to Mayor Menino and his strength. Let's use the mayor's inspiration to continue to bring together institutions, organizations, and very importantly, really individual people in a common effort to make learning safe, exciting, and successful for Boston's youth.
Thank you, Gil, and he's putting the microphone in his hand. I'm getting nervous. First time I've been said I'm a warm-up act. I've been said a lot of things, Larry, but it's really great to be over here at Harvard with all you folks who are making a difference in education, and also with Larry Summers, who's been my partner for the last couple of years on improving education in the city of Boston. Now, one thing about you say about your president over here, that he understands how public education works, and he wants to be involved in what we're doing, not just in Boston, but other cities and towns, and also this nation. We have a lot of folks out there who talk about no child left behind. Well, a lot of children are being left behind, and a lot of mandates out there talking about mandates and no money behind those mandates, and they expect it all to do it with blue smoke and mirrors, and it can't happen with blue smoke and mirrors. And so we have to get serious about this issue of education. We all have to work together. And so I'm really, as mayor, I've made the expansion of after-school programs in Boston my top priority, because I understand the tremendous impact quality after-school programming can have on the kids' lives. I'm out in the neighborhoods every day, and it's probably the best part of my job. And no matter where I go, I hear the same comments from parents, teachers, and religious leaders. After-school programming works, and it's vital to the success of our young people. And one of the reason I think is, when you look at the diversity of our classrooms in Boston, you might go into any classroom in the city of Boston, you may have 40 different cultures within that classroom. How do you expect teachers to teach all those kids the same? They need that reinforcement. And that's why I look at after-school programs. Help them what goes on in the classroom. It can't just happen in that 5 or 6 hours. And also, we live in a time when parents must work longer hours outside the home. And that has increased the need for kids to have some kind of support from adults outside their family. It's not just about taking kids off our streets. It's about connecting young people with adults in their community. Adults will serve as mentors and forge strong, meaningful relationships with our children. After-school program, as I look at it, shapes the whole person. It reinforces the academic lessons that are taught during the school year. It provides opportunities for sports and recreation, and exposes kids to the arts. And that's, education does not just come, like I said, that 5 or 6 hours of classroom work. What you're exposed to, the arts, recreation, whatever it may be, it helps the kid grow. But most importantly, it helps build self-confidence. And when young people have healthy self-confidence, they are better equipped to tackle life's challenges and to realize their dreams. I've worked hard over the last few years to give our children in the city the resources and support systems they need to achieve their full potential. But we need more to bridge what happens during the school day with what goes on in after-school programs. Not simply extending the school day, but creating exciting opportunities that extend the concept they need to learn in school to really bring the learning process full cycle. Boston needs the universities and community partners to come together to help us improve the quality and quantity of after-school programs for our children and our families. 5 years ago, my goal was to have 3,000 kids in after-school programs. And today, we have 7,500 kids in after-school programs. I also want to look at what the Boston After School for All Partnership, which is led by Chris Gabrielli, a 5-year, $24.5 million funding commitment from 13 leading organizations. By working together, we've made great strides in expansion, learning, and sustainable financing. And with their help, we nearly doubled the number of children, like I said, attending the after-school programs in our city. Harvard's convener of you folks today, all the folks in this room, is an important contribution to the after-school programs in the field of after-school also. In Boston, we have a place a strong collaboration committed to addressing the issues of how to effectively bridge school and after-school learning, and how to build after-school programs that build strong relationships between adults and our kids. That's why I'm really glad to be here today. We're focused on precisely on how to learn, on how learning takes place in relationships, and how learning, in turn, strengthens relationships for children and youth. The universities must work closely with youth development and community partners to really strengthen the after-school field, to conduct a solid research and evaluation, create an effective clearinghouse on information, and to link schools, extended day goals, and outcomes. And one of the things I always say is about programs, we spend money on programs, but what's the effect? What does a kid get out of that program during the course of the 5 days of the school year? We have to evaluate what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong. And that's a very key component of all these programs. We have thousands of programs. And I keep on saying to my folks, some of them probably did a real evaluation on them. We could put that money someplace else. Because we did things for 25 years sometimes, we could, we could do away with some. One Department of Public Health in the city eliminated 5 programs, Department of Public Health, just think about this, 5 programs in the last budget. I didn't get one call from anybody on them. Just think about that. They were there for 25 years. But because they were for 25 years, nobody had the guts to remove them. And you got to look at what the programs you're doing. Some of the stuff you've been doing for a lot of years, outdated. You don't need it anymore, and don't serve anybody. They serve the 2 or 3 people who work on those programs, keep them in a full-time job. But do they serve, is their mission out there serving people? And that's what we've got to think about today with the limited resources we have in our society. We've got to take a look at every program we have. The after-school program is one of my programs I think we get the most from, because I see our MCAS scores going up, SAT scores going up. I see a real progress being made in education. But look at some of the other things you're working on. Are they necessary today? They were necessary yesterday. Are they necessary today? That's a real question. So I ask all of you, we all have a stake in the success of our children. Let's all work together to clearly define what success looks like for our children, academically and socially. Also, I just want to say to everyone, thank you for being here. This is so important this day. I look forward to the report after. I see some folks out there who I see almost every day that I do events in the city of Boston. I appreciate the work you do for us. But as you go through this day, at the end of the day, Let's have an action plan. Let's talk about some changes. Let's talk about some reinforcements. It's so important that we do what is necessary to improve the education of our children. That should be our top priority. It's not a top priority anymore. People talk about it, but there's nothing behind that talk. It's all left to the localities to deal with this issue of public education today, and that's unfortunate. So thank you very much for listening to me this morning, and let's continue to work together to improve our future. Our future is our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, very much. I would like now to introduce President Summers. I'm thrilled, actually, to introduce President Lawrence Summers to this conference, to you this morning. We here are all aware of Larry Summers' passion for advancing learning through a Socratic style of intense intellectual debate. When he got off the elevator this morning, he bombarded at least 4 questions, like what's the statistic about the evidence that after school makes a difference? And it was great, actually. I did not feel attacked. I felt that this is a person who wants to learn and he wants to know the facts, and that's exactly what we need. The President realizes that the support of learning cannot be enclosed within traditional institutional boundaries, either within Harvard, within the schools at Harvard, or outside of Harvard. In fact, one of the things that Bob Kargman and I found and discussed was a speech that Larry Summers gave in which he introduced the term all-day engaged learning as a very important aspect of Harvard's mission. And it became very clear to us that actually all-day engaged learning is what we are about, that it is not just about an adjunct of after-school hours, 2 or 3 hours in the afternoon. It is most centrally about education reform and youth development, a new way of thinking about how children learn, and I think the mayor just described that beautifully. Many of the salient issues we are grappling with in extended day learning are the same ones in a certain way that Harvard is trying to address in its own curriculum and that Larry Summers is leading. For example, Larry Summers supports the search for new pedagogies that bring learning to life, for example, the case method. He is attempting to form a clear consensus on exactly what students need to know, deliberately linking different areas of knowledge in such a way as to overcome rigid academic boundaries. And last but not least, acting every day on the knowledge that much of real learning occurs outside the classroom, not just inside the classroom. These pursuits are the same ones that this community of educators here assembled today is pursuing, not in higher education so much, but in the education of our children in Boston and elsewhere. I would like to point out one other thing that many of you might know. President Summers himself does after-school work. Yes, in fact, the President is renowned for his informal evening debating sessions with students, during which he offers himself liberally as a listener, intellectual mentor, and teacher. And in fact, the students really, really respond to his willingness to engage in debate and not to just say yes to things and not follow up, but to really go to the depth that they expect of their leader. The 3 activities I've just mentioned, listening, mentoring, and teaching, also form the essence of the after-school movement. Thank you, President Summers, for joining us in this morning.
Gil, thank you very, very much for what surely was an overly generous introduction. I'm reminded of an experience I had in Washington when I had the occasion to introduce President Clinton, and I extolled his many virtues in the financial area, and he responded by saying, "Larry, you've just demonstrated one of my first laws of political life." And he waited, and then he said, "Whenever possible, be introduced by someone who works within an organization that you lead." Well, it occurred to me that there's actually a corollary for this occasion. I actually started thinking about this around the university. Whenever possible, be introduced by someone whose work you help to fund. So I am very, you may have some experience with that as well, Mr. Mayor. I'm really glad to be here. I'm really glad to be here with the mayor of Boston and to welcome him to Harvard and to the city of Cambridge. You know, we are all very fortunate in the kind of mayor we have. I was very struck a couple months ago. Tom and I were participants in an event around summer youth programs at a park in South Boston. And we got there, and a few minutes before the event started, and I was kind of standing there waiting for it to start. You could see the mayor. He was looking over. There was a shard of glass sitting somewhere in that park, and he mentioned it to somebody. Didn't look like things had quite been cleaned up in another area, and he was mentioning that. Another part of the park was really set up in a perfect way, and he commented on that. It was obvious that the basic quality of the environment on every square foot of the city of Boston was of profound concern to him. And that attitude has a great deal to do with why people in Boston are living better than they were 10 years ago. It is a real example of an important aspect of leadership, Mr. Mayor. It's one that I've tried to learn from, and a lot of people who don't have a chance to see it don't appreciate how much of a difference you make. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Gil, I'll say a little more about what you're involved in a few moments, but thank you very much for your leadership with respect to this conference. Without the generosity of the Cargmans, this event would not be possible, and we at Harvard are grateful for your vision, and yes, I don't shrink from saying we are grateful for your tangible support as well. Thank you very much to the Cargmans. The Duke of Wellington famously observed that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. That was an elitist age. The battle for America's future will be won or lost in the next century in America's urban public schools. It will be won or lost in American public schools because they are the crucible in which the young people who will comprise the largest part of our population a quarter century from now will be formed. If those schools succeed in their mission, ours will be a country of greater democracy, greater civility, greater prosperity, greater humaneness, and greater inclusion. It will truly be an even greater beacon to the world. If those schools do not succeed in their mission, our country risks being a country that is increasingly divided between rich and poor, between black and white. It risks being a country whose capacity to compete internationally and maintain our prosperity will be diminished. And it risks being a country whose values and civility will be less of a model to the world. There is therefore no more important issue than what happens in the schools. There are many, many parts of that issue and of the challenges facing the schools. But I am convinced that as central and as crucial as what happens in the school day during the regular school experience is, when somebody looks back at the history of American education and writes the definitive history 50 years from now, that a significant part of it will be about the evolutionary changes that took place not in what happened during the traditional 6 hours a day, 180 days a year, 13 years from kindergarten to 12th grade, but will be about the things we did or did not do before children went to school, will be about the things we did or did at the age of 5, will be about the things we did or did not do during the 180 days out of the year that they are not in school, particularly in the summer, and will be about the things that they did or did not do with the other 10 hours a day outside of those 6 hours that children were not in school. And if the battle for America's future is going to be won, it is not going to be won only within that 6-hour school day. And that is why the subject that we're discussing today is so profoundly important. That's why the mayor's strategies for the schools and the strategies for the young people of Boston have put such emphasis on each of those margins: early childhood, the summer, and our subject today, after school education. Because those are the fronts on which this battle is going to be won or is going to be lost. You know, the stakes here are very, very high. And that's why, in addition to highlighting the importance of this, in addition to celebrating the fact that we are cooperating, in addition to the fact that I'm proud that Harvard has been able to make a significant resource contribution to the mayor's efforts, in addition to the fact that we are pleased with the sense of partnership and well-being that is around this, there's another aspect that I want to highlight, and it comes out of something that the mayor emphasized. Tom, when you spoke powerfully as you did about the importance of evaluation, I am sure that you wrapped up the vote of every econometrician in the city of Boston in the next election. I'm not entirely sure that there are a lot of other people for whom that message is a political winner. But let me tell you something. If we had the same commitment or lack of commitment to evaluation in medicine that we have traditionally had in many spheres of education, we would still be leeching people to make them better. If you look at the history of medicine over the last century, I would submit to you that the invention of the controlled experiment as a tool of rigorous evaluation was surely among the 10 most important medical innovations of that century. And it is madness to spend tens of billions of dollars in literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different school districts in different ways without devising methodologies that rigorously evaluate what works and what does not work, and growing what works and shrinking what does not. The failure to evaluate what works and the allowance of children to continue year after year after year in programs that we don't know whether they do work or do not work is leaving our children behind in every bit as real a way as leaving them in classrooms that are not fully painted or not providing them with modern textbooks. If the medical profession was prescribing drugs whose efficacy nobody had tested, the people who ran the FDA would be strung up. And there has been too much of that for too long in education. And that is why the evaluation of what we do, and the mayor said something very important. He said that sometimes when you evaluate things, you find that they do not work. And then you stop doing them and you do other things. The adoption of that idea in education is something that is of profound importance. That is why I think the significance of this conference lies not just in the significance of after-school education, not just in the importance of partnership, but in the idea that I think needs to be ever more central in the way we approach social problems in this country. And that is this: the more morally important something is, the more important it is that we think rigorously, carefully, and logically about it. And we don't simply allow the fact that we care a lot and the fact that we have compassion to blind us to the need to evaluate with rigor. And if we are able to do that in this city, we will do better, and in this country, we will do better. And if Harvard is able to contribute in some small way to bringing about that approach in our country, we will have made an enormous contribution. Because after all, it is the place of great institutions like this one, of great schools like the School of Education, of great new leaders like your Dean, Ellen Lageman, who can't be here today, to show the way towards ways of thinking that will make us that much more effective. You know, this will not be an easy challenge. It will not be an easy challenge for many reasons. There is much more enthusiasm for reporting success than for reporting failure. There are many who want to do what they're doing and want to believe that it works, but aren't fully willing to put the proposition to a test. There is a great challenge also, and it is a challenge for the scholars in this room, and that is this. There are some things that are easy to measure. You can give a kid a math test. There are some things that are hard to measure. Does a kid have the self-confidence to go forward effectively in life? Question the mayor raised. The things that are hard to measure are every bit as important. In some cases, they're more important. The things that are easy to measure. And if we're going to succeed, as I think we must, in finding ways to evaluate what we do, we are going to have to devise the means and the methods to assure that evaluation is about not just what is quantifiable, but also about what is important. And how we are going to evaluate in ways that get at what is important and also maintain the kind of objectivity that is central for it to be real, is a very great question that I hope you will all ponder today. You are part in this conference of something that is very important to this university, but much more significant, very important to the future of our country. And I am very, very grateful to everyone who is here and who is part of this conference for what they have contributed and what they are going to contribute. And Mr. Mayor, we look forward to working with you very closely on these questions for a very long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you for staying with us much longer than you had expected, and thank you for your kind remarks, your very important remarks. We will take this and take it the next step, and now we will let you go because you have many other things to do.
See what I said about people whose work you fund? Usually when you ramble on at substantially excessive length, it's not called, they don't express their gratitude for your having stayed longer in your busy schedule. I apologize for having rambled on, Gil. Bye-bye.
What Larry does not realize is that I don't work for the mayor, and I was equally kind to the mayor. Okay. Let's move on. I would like to now kind of shape the day, and I actually can tell you that what I had hoped for and what we as an organizing committee had hoped for has happened this morning and more. In other words, to have both Mayor Menino and President Summers shape the discussion and make very clear where they locate after-school education in ways actually that were novel to me. I know their commitment, I know how important it is to them, but I did not know quite the shape of it. I did not know that President Summers is as committed to what happens in the non-school hours and how much he sees them as part of the success and the urgent success in education. I think that was a very important statement that has kind of institutional implications. So before I hand over the microphone to Bob Cargman, who is going to address us briefly, I just want to mention to you that the first conference, the first time we met a year and a half ago, the topic was bridging, especially bridging educational experiences between the school day and the after-school hours. As I reflected, and as we reflected as a small group last night, for those of you who are visiting us from out of town, what is the difference from last year to this year? We came up with this idea that maybe the field has shifted in this 1.5 year period to a metaphor that should be different. Not anymore bridging, but that there is more of a consensus that has been developing in this time, actually quite rapidly, and where the idea is that we should maybe think in concentric circles, as some of the presentations will do during the day. Namely, spaces that are located at the intersection and that create a new need for language and outcomes and, like President Summers says, evaluation. So that maybe even the bridging metaphor is not the best metaphor anymore, but the metaphor of convergence is. I don't know, what am I competing against here? Okay, so with this, I want to hand over the mic to Bob Cargman, who is with us in an amazing commitment. He just had hip surgery, and it would not stop him from being with us today.
I think what's in store is extremely exciting, and I don't want to get too much in the way of that. These are not built for short people. But I would like to just say a few things. First, as you see in the program, it says the second annual conference, Learning with Excitement. So I'm assuring you that there will be a third and a fourth and a fifth. So what are we about in doing that? And I'd like to start with a story from a teacher who taught me when I was teaching a program in East Boston several years ago. I went back into the Boston Public Schools to teach a course on negotiation to 8th graders. And this teacher who had taught, actually run the Chelsea Public School experiment, and then was now the superintendent of schools in Mansfield, woman about 4 or 5, who was the toughest, most frightening person I've ever been in a room with. And she said to me, "Hey, you're in the real estate business, right?" I said, "Right." She said, "Okay, so what are the 3 elements of a successful real estate deal?" I said, "Yeah, you're joking, but the cliche is true. Location, location, location." I said, if you want to do a successful real estate deal, those are the 3 elements of any successful real estate deal. She said, "Great. What are the 3 elements of being a successful teacher and having a successful teaching experience?" So that was the challenge she threw out to me. What do you think? Anybody got an idea they want to hazard? Relationship, relationship, relationship. What she basically said to me was, if you're teaching in the Boston Public Schools, and she asked me all kinds of hard questions about my relationships with my kids, none of which I could say yes, she said, throw it all away. Nothing is happening in your classroom. And that really opened my eyes to what it is that we're really about in this enterprise of learning. And what I mean by that is, when we say learning with excitement, I'd actually like to turn those words around. And what I would say is excitement because I'm learning. And if you really think about, as I've done, when Larry said we'll know what America is by what we do going forward, I look at it in almost in a global way. I say, we used to think that the good life was the afterlife. People were good on this life to be, eternally rewarded. Or perhaps the Marxian millenarian notion of, if we just get through these revolutions, we're going to establish the perfect society. Well, we've tossed all that away, and there's one fundamental kernel which is true for me, and I think true for all of you, and this is why Larry Summers, when he says we have to evaluate, is talking about something mysterious, which isn't mysterious at all. And that is that I don't think there is anything more exciting to any of us than feeling that we are living and learning every minute of our lives, and that enhances us, and we are able to project our learning and help others learn. We're not only a learning organization, but we're a learning society. And that, I think, is, to me, where the 21st century is all about, which is how do we, who have been so privileged to have had the backgrounds that we have, create that excitement in living and learning for all kids, everybody who really doesn't have it. That's the charge. So when we look at these Learning with Excitement conferences, when Gil says, have we evolved, where are we going? I think it's really extraordinary. We're going to hear from Ian Fordham, who's going to come and talk to us the way, when I read Ian's paper, for those of you who've read it, I said it's like, you know, those the Dr. Spock movies in the planet, in the constellation, the galaxy Ugong. You know, we see that that's the kind of society we're going to be 10,000 years from now. They got it. They figured it all out. And the figuring it out issues are not that difficult. I'm reminded when Jeff Canada was here last year, the guy from the Bronx who teaches very troubled kids in Harlem. He wrote this book, Fist, Stick, Knife, Gun. And he said, what's all this evaluation? Everybody's got me being evaluated. He said, I look around and I say, who are the successful kids? The kids in Weston, Wellesley, Brookline, Newton, the kids in the private schools. He says, well, what have they got? Are they people coming in and evaluating them? No. They have deep relationships, vast opportunities, ways of having their interests expanded and explored. He said, let's just create that for all kids. You know, it's not a mystery. We know where success lies. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. But as we go forward, we have to be very rigorous as we go. So from my point of view, where we have moved from Conference 1 to Conference 2, and the charge really between this conference and our next conference is that, in my mind, we moved from the vocabulary of bridging school and after school and the necessity for the rich experiences in relationships and youth development. That's where we were a year and a half ago. What Ian Fordham is going to say is that there's really 3 circles, and they all are necessary. And his vocabulary is that we have to enable the curriculum, and that's all of those supports that enable kids to be in programs. We have to extend the curriculum, and that is those bridgings between the school day and the after-school day, and we have to enlarge the curriculum. And that's all of the other kinds of activities and supports which can only be done in after-school. So the 3 E's, to enable, to extend, enlarge, and we were going to have it all put in plastic as to how these circles, and that we are not competing for resources. We are all resources that must go in to what Larry Summers' vision of, successful schools. So I don't want to bore you any further, and that's the challenge: is what can we take from today that moves us towards the 3rd annual conference and moves us ahead of where we are today. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. It's rare to have a funder who is as intellectually involved and really wants to be part of and is part of this whole movement. Is there a reason why? Oh, I see. I think technology is taking over in a good way, which is to move us forward. And I had a plan to kind of shape the day a little more. I think I will not do that. Bob has mentioned a number of things already, and I think the mayor's remarks and Larry Summers' remarks were also shaping. So I just want to tell you 2 things. The first one is that what we have as a goal is very difficult and ambitious. I think the danger of a conference like this is that we have great speeches and talks. You mentioned Ian, Bob, but I think Karen has simultaneously introduced a very, very creative way of integrating and finding a common space between different types of learning. And the other speakers this afternoon will do the same thing. But the danger is that we will be entertained, we will learn, we will be intellectually satisfied, and then we'll have the discussions, the small group discussions, and everyone will agree and disagree, and at the end of the evening, or the end of the afternoon, sorry, don't worry. At the end of the afternoon, everyone goes home with a kind of sense of confusion, slight dissatisfaction, because somehow it doesn't quite come together. And we would really like you to help in this approach of not spending the whole day on differences, because it's very easy to have a discussion about how youth development and prevention and schools and after school, how it all kind of is different and the context is different. We need to make clear distinctions. But I think the goal for us today is to, by the end of the day, to begin to have action steps, ideas of where next steps might lie. We at the Program in After School Education and Research will then pull together a report that draws on this. So we don't want to overwhelm you with this idea that you have to come up with a report by tonight, and we will then distribute it. But it is a working session, and as such we would like it to be as productive. And we want that in part because your time is valuable, and I think sitting through a day without some outcomes at the end would be disappointing. The second thing I wanted to mention is, why are we doing this? How does this connect? Why are these papers at all connected? We'll leave it to you to figure out whether they are and they aren't, but a little bit of a roadmap might be useful. The first thing you should know about this is that we wanted to take examples that are actually research-based, but also policy-focused, because we believe that it is time, with lots of initiatives, citywide initiatives, the California initiative, which is very large, and the Great Britain initiative as an example of a whole country actually addressing out-of-school time and the integration of out-of-school time with school day learning. We wanted to actually look at the state of policy and the state, not just policy of people making plans, but policy in the sense of people, organizations making a difference in cities and countries and states. So we have examples for that, and that's one organizing theme of the conference. The other organizing theme of the conference is the combination of two movements in after school that seem to be coming together. The first one is simple: learning. There is now, I think, a consensus or a growing consensus that after school education, that's why it's education and not only after school care, it's also after school care, but it's also after school education, is about giving children a learning environment, involving children in learning and making it possible for children to have a voice in their own learning. So it is in part about a new pedagogy. There are lots of issues, but we want to focus on the area of learning and how to make after-school programs stronger as learning communities. The second part is a movement that connects to mentoring. The first one is, of course, very connected to youth development and school reform. The second one is connected to mentoring, which is an equally strong and equally funded kind of area of national attention, again with a focus on policy. The idea is that children in after-school settings can have informal and strong relationships with adults the way they should have these relationships with teachers in the school day as well. But we have created schools where it's hard for teachers to develop these kinds of relationships with their students. And also there's a lot of evaluation going on between teachers and students, which has to, and so the relationships will always be different. But to learn from research what these relationships are like and how important they are for children's learning, that we're not going to just create learning communities unless we address the very basic need that children have for relationships, and the fact that the children are typically learning not just for the topic and the content of what they're introduced to, but for a teacher and a person who they admire, who they look up to, and who they feel they're in relationship with. So if we can bring those two movements together, we have not brought everything together, but we have brought two highly funded areas of policy and highly important areas for everyday life in a program. You can take any program and you will see those two things intertwined: the quality of relationships or the lack of quality of relationships, of sustained relationships, and the focus on exciting learning for children and youth in these programs. So for that reason, we chose these topics and brought them together in this way. With this, I would like to introduce Ian Fordham. Can you both come up here? By the way, is there any way to get some light here? I know that we need it off in a minute, but I won't be able to read without it. So I would actually like to start with Karen. Karen Pittman is Executive Director of the Forum of Youth Investment in Washington, D.C. Karen is a sociologist and recognized leader in the field of youth development. She writes incredible amounts, and not like many of us who write a lot and repeat themselves. She's one of the writers who actually each time takes the opportunity to expand her thinking and her learning, and that's a really incredible strategy, incredible gift actually to the field, because she is not only a reflector of the field, but in her reflection she's actually moving the field forward. So we're very lucky to have her not only here today, but as a contributor to the field. Today she has brought us her ideas in the paper called Blurring the Lines of Learning, the Role of Out-of-School Programs as Complements to Formal Learning. She's also addressing in this paper a lot of the questions about outcomes that Larry Summers began to address this morning. What are realistic outcomes to measure, and how do they relate to the programs? So with that, Karen.
Good morning. You hear me well enough? In the back? How's that? Okay. You've been talked at a lot. Do you want to stand up? Stand up. Stand up. Just turn around, stretch, say hello to your neighbor, take a second. I know it's always a risk letting you stand, but now you have to sit back down. It's a pleasure to be here. You have a paper in your packet. I think there's out on a table at the entrance table. There's actually something called Forum Focus, which is an insert that we started doing a newsletter inside of Youth Today, for those of you who get Youth Today. And everything that I say appears on our website at some point. So if you type in www.forumforyouth.investment.org, you'll get to lots of stuff. We also do, with funding from the Mott Foundation, about 4 or 5 issues a year of something called out-of-school time policy. That's sort of taking these issues and looking at them from a policy perspective. But there's lots of stuff. So what I'm going to do, minus the title page, is keep you awake by showing you about 20 slides in 20 minutes. I'll try to keep the pace going. I'm not going to repeat exactly what's in the paper, but just try to sort of frame for you where I think we are with some of these issues, and it builds very much on what's already been said. So in some ways you could just read the paper and take a break, but since I came, we'll do this. Okay. First, framing the challenge. Where we start, and I have to start by saying the term youth development gets used lots of ways. I use it in the broadest way. That youth development basically is an approach for working with young people. It takes the best of what we know from research and practice, and it tells us how we should work with young people. Youth development also is used to define a set of outcomes, which suggests that they should be positive, not just outcomes, especially when we talk to teens about preventing problems. It's also used to define a particular set of programs and organizations that use that approach, which are primarily organizations that are community-based and operating in the out-of-school hours. But for right now, when I say youth development, I mean the approach, the principles that we use to work with young people in any setting that we happen to find them. So let's start with some basic things that we know. And at the forum, it doesn't matter who we're talking to, we take a youth-centered approach to this, which says let's start with what we know about young people. We think we know 3 things at least. We're a lot, but there are 3 things that people don't seem to argue with. 1, that young people need and deserve supports throughout their waking hours. 2nd, that they need early and sustained investments throughout at least the first 2 decades of life. And 3rd, that they need those investments to help them achieve a broad range of outcomes. We also think that we know that the progress that young people make is directly correlated with the quality and the quantity of the supports, the services, and opportunities I receive. And that these supports are offered not just by families and schools, two critical institutions, but by a full range of organizations and individuals who touch their lives. So those are some basics that we think we know enough about. We can do to put those up, and you'll believe them. So we're here to talk about learning. One of the things that we want to do is to stress the idea that there's lots of learning that needs to happen. Cognitive academic learning is important, but learning, in other words, the acquisition of knowledge and skills and then figuring out how to apply that knowledge and skills in useful ways to help you get where you're going, has to happen across lots of areas. That's one way to suggest them. You could put up others. Takeaway, lots of learning needs to happen. The National Research Council, in a book that came out last year called Community Programs to Promote Youth Development, talks about 4 big areas for learning: physical development, intellectual development, psychological and emotional development, and social development. Now, these were mostly psychologists and social workers, and so if you were thinking about this, especially from a teen perspective, you might want to pull out civic engagement, and you might want to pull out vocational preparation as things that also are big topics that take up a lot of our time. But all the words are there. You can bold the ones that you want. The point is reinforcement from the National Academy of Sciences, National Research Council, that there really is a lot of stuff that has to happen, and the more intentional we are about helping all of it happen, the better. You take those 3 ideas that I put up a second ago. We have to pay attention to young people from when they're little to when they're big, when they wake up to when they go to sleep, and across a range of outcome areas. Now, it seems to me that I've been saying that for about 30 years, and we're still doing it wrong. So we decided to draw a picture to make it even clearer. And there's something that turns out, at least for a lot of folks, to be magic about this picture, which is somehow when you take those 3 things and you make them the axes of a cube, we've defined a space. And we call it developmental space. Our job is to fill that space, or is to help young people fill that space. Because the challenge is they're going to fill that space one way or another. Every day they're going to wake up, they're going to look for people to talk to, places to go, and things to do. We can help, we can not help, but as long as they're alive, they're going to get up and they're going to do something. So we have a challenge to be intentional about filling that space. I'm not going to go through, for the sake of time, a bunch of slides that would build it, but the point that you've heard over and over again already this morning is that when you think about it, school, formal school, doesn't fill much of that space. It doesn't fill it all from an age perspective, especially if we're honest about our dropout rates. It doesn't fill it all from a time perspective, as was mentioned several times, and increasingly it doesn't fill it all from an outcomes perspective. The more we narrow our focus on academics and standards and meeting the tests, the more we lose some of those things that naturally were happening in schools. So remember, there's developmental space to be filled. Our challenge is to fill it. That's where learning happens, in that full space. School doesn't fill the whole space. Not school's fault. It just isn't designed to fill the whole space, so we have to think about what happens in the rest. Who's responsible for the rest? Lots of folks. You can read the list. I won't read it to you. But the point that I'm trying to make is, at various points in the day, we're going to have a discussion about after-school programs. Because of the way funding is starting to come down, because of the way we're beginning to build an infrastructure for after-school programs, we're going to have a tendency to narrow our definition of them. Keep the cube in mind. Our long-term goal is to fill the whole space for all kids, teens, not just those who need supervision because they have working parents and they're under 13. It means that it's a bigger job, but it also means that we have more resources if we think about all these resources. So, as we go into talking about learning and focusing on learning, let's go to a little simpler picture, a 2-dimensional one, and ask, when and where does learning happen? And again, what's exciting for me is that there's movement in all these boxes. Well, clearly one focuses on how we improve the learning that happens in the school building during the school day. We now have a push to say we can make learning continue to happen in the school building after the school day in a formal way that we can be accountable for, responsible for, put money into, especially public dollars flowing in there. We've always had learning happening in the community outside of the school day, that bottom quadrant, and increasingly, and this is something that's actually happening as a natural result of the connections that are happening in the name of after school, we've got learning happening during the day in the community. So when you think about it, you've got those folks that we talked about spreading themselves out across those boxes. And again, so as we think about what's our charge, this will all be up on the website. You can draw if it keeps you awake, but you don't have to write it down. When you think about what our charge is, it really is to remember all of the players as we're talking about this. And we can focus in, if we want, on what needs to happen to make sure that after-school programs that are being funded through the educational system and happening in conjunction with the educational system keep their flexibility and their nimbleness to be able to do what we want them to do. That's an additional challenge, but remember that there's a bigger universe. We also come into this with some basic assumptions about learning that go along with those spaces. That formal learning, in other words, you sit in a chair and look at me, I talk to you, that happens in that school building during the school day. That sometimes there are community partners that come in during the school day and enrich learning. That informal or applied learning sort of happens out of school in community-based organizations. And really right now, in some ways, we're having a debate. We're coming to consensus, but we're having a debate over which of those roles get played in the out-of-school hours, in school buildings, with school dollars. Is it supervision? Is it remediation? Is it enrichment? Is it engagement? That's a conversation that's going on right now. Those don't have to be mutually exclusive things. It's just if we're going to do them all, it takes money. It takes money, it takes training, it takes time, it takes being intentional. So the other thing that's beginning to happen is that we're getting increasing evidence, and this is where the National Research Council report also helps, that it really does help young people if you mix this stuff up, if you blur the lines. Not just blur the lines in a sense of keeping the doors open longer, but blur the lines and mix up the ways that we think about learning. So there's increasing evidence that good learning environments are the same across the range of settings where learning happens. Now, we have to adjust, and once we start with the basics, we adjust it based on how many young people are in the room, what the accountability structure is, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a core set of things, again, lots of people have written these up. This is the list that comes from the National Research Council. And, you know, again, if we had time, I could put up 10 more lists that say roughly the same thing. Lists that have come out of youth employment, that have come out of after school, that have come out of education, that have come out of youth work, that have come out of prevention. Same kind of lists. What do we need to have in these environments? Safety, physical and psychological, structure, supportive relationships, said 3 times, relationships, 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 opportunities to belong, positive social norms, support for efficacy and mattering, feeling that you exist, that you make a difference, that you're important, clear opportunities for skill building, and we want to emphasize that as important in all learning environments, and then connections between family, school, and community, putting this learning in context. Now, again, lots of folks have done it. You can pick lots of lists. The point is there's now a research base that's been validated. It was there, but it's been validated that says this needs to happen. And when the Research Council did their research, because there wasn't enough research on community programs, they looked at school literature, they looked at the family literature, so they blurred the lines in putting this list together. So let's call the question. We're here to talk about learning. We're here to talk about learning with excitement. We're also here in a climate of people asking us to make sure that after-school programs, if they're going to get money, help support academic outcomes. Well, what do we mean by that? What do we mean by academic achievement? When we put the call out and we say, these programs have to support academic achievement. Well, let's take the words apart. Academic, we certainly mean core skills, reading, writing, math, those basic things. We mean that blur of stuff that we call higher order thinking skills, problem solving, et cetera. We also mean something about some specific content knowledge, whether it's geography or world history or whatever. We've got something in our heads when we say academic. We also have something in our heads when we say achievement. Ideally, it would be achievement motivation, but we also, because we're looking at this, mean progress. You know more in grade 4 than you knew in grade 3. It may mean competence, either competence defined by a test score, but ideally competence defined by some sort of real-life standards. So we have to take apart academic, we take apart achievement. There's a piece that just came out recently by Beth Miller looking at sort of summing up what we know, and lots of folks have done it. The folks at the Harvard Family Research Program have done it, summing up what we know about after-school programs. And again, we're trying to be honest here. We're trying to be modest. We're trying to find things that we can be held accountable for. Right now, what we can say is that good after-school programs clearly have an impact on participation in school, whether we're talking about attendance, we're talking about behavior, we're talking about kids staying awake in class, whatever it is. We know there is a range of things that gets you to that first thing of the young person is in the door, in the chair, and looking at you. We also know that after-school programs done well have an impact on engagement and learning. For some young people, they can rekindle their confidence and interest in learning. You know that drill. So that young people can show up, not just show up more in school, but show up with a better attitude towards learning and with better confidence in themselves as learners. But the question that's being called is, can after-school programs have a direct impact on that stuff we called academic achievement? Can they increase math scores, reading scores, et cetera? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no, as we look at the data. I think the point has to be, and there's a quote, whoops, let me back up. There's a quote at the bottom there that Karen Walker, who's a senior vice president for public-private ventures and was the principal investigator for the Beacons evaluation in San Francisco, as well as others, she sums it up and basically says, if you want academic effects, you probably have to have academic content. Now, that's not really a surprise, but we need to get there. If we're going to ask after-school programs to not just increase participation in school, not just increase engagement in learning, but actually have some kind of impact, and hopefully we'll assume it's going to be a modest impact given their hours, but some kind of impact on academic achievement, then we have to think about what the content is. Now, what do we mean? Well, the easy way that we've started to do impact on content is to just extend it. So take the explicit content, I want this young person to learn long division. I send that long division homework into the after-school program, and I say, long division homework gets done. So explicit content, traditional delivery, let's bring it in to these hours and make sure it gets done. Give it more time. So that's the theory that says if they didn't learn it in school, but we give them more time, they'll learn it in after school. We also have some things going on that I would call explicit, but they are taking that content, they're not being shy about it, but they're doing innovative delivery. And in the paper, you've got an example of the Bell program that's doing this, and there are others. There are lots of them. But this is basically saying we can find ways to do learning with excitement. We can label it math, we can label it science, we can label it writing, but we can do this in ways that are hands-on, interactive, working with teams, et cetera. So traditional content, innovative delivery. You also have an example in the paper of what I would call embedded content, innovative delivery. People who are very intentionally saying, if you want young people to learn these things, and I really want them to learn stained glass making, how can I figure out which skills on your list they actually can learn and build on in the context of learning how to build a stained glass window, or in the context of putting on a play, or in the context of researching something that they want to take to the city council. How can we identify and label the skills and make sure that we're doing those in conjunction with the larger outcome? So that was what I would be calling an embedded program. And then clearly, because we don't want to forget about them, let's sort of spread them to the extremes, there are what we are now calling, at least for today, enrichment programs. Programs that have authentic content and innovative delivery. By authentic content, I mean they are what they are. If the young person ends up doing reading or math in the course of getting where they're trying to go, that's great. And a good program that has a focus on a skill or an outcome is going to do that, but it's not intentionally embedded in there. So there's a range of ways that we can think about programs, and then just remember Karen Walker's phrase. If you want academic content, if we want to hold programs accountable for that, then let's make sure that they're doing it either in an explicit way or an embedded way. And if they're going to do it in the extended way, let's make sure that they're doing homework help well. That's a whole other conversation, which I know Gil can have with you later on. So let's look at learning in context. And this is the message that I want to leave you with, because I think it does help us blur the lines, and it does help us address both what President Summers and Mayor Menino said this morning, which was very important. We are in the 21st century. And at this point, I think we have a real opportunity to, if not maybe just even erase the lines between these things that we're calling education and youth development, school and after school. We can erase them from a time perspective, but I think we can also start to erase them from a content perspective. There's a piece that's come out recently called 21st Century Skills, put out by the Partnership for 21st Century Skills, which was a partnership between the Department of Education and some of the major technology companies. They started out looking at what it was going to take to meet the technology, the 8th grade technology requirement. What they ended up doing was basically sort of rewriting the SCANS report, for those of you who remember the report on sort of employee skills. So these are business folks in education saying, what are the skills we really need for the 21st century? They took a year, talked to lots of people, went back through the research, and put back together a list, which is also in your paper. So the full list isn't up here. But the point is, when we talk about skills, we clearly need to talk about core skills, reading, writing, computation, but we also need to add into the mix another set of skills that probably really were mid-20th century skills, but they're certainly 21st century skills, technology, problem solving, etc. We can also talk about things that young people want to build, which are skills or building on interest from a personal perspective. So if you made this into a grid, which I didn't do late at night, there's core skills that we want to work on. There's 21st century skills, which I'll show you in a minute. There's broad agreement on that every young person should have them. And then there's a collective things that young people may want to build that speak to their interest. The same is true for content. There's core content that we've all decided young people need to have. There's 21st century, that should say content that's being added. Financial literacy is coming up repeatedly. Global awareness is an obvious one. Civic education has been re-immersed as a key theme that we want to look at and figure out how do we do this better in schools. So there's new content that we want to make sure is happening. And then there are contexts. And clearly at this moment, school is a place where we not just acquire knowledge but apply knowledge isn't enough. We need to look at how young people take it out and apply it in the 21st century in lots of places. So we have a broader demand for the knowledge and skills that need to be acquired across content areas, and we've also got increased demand that young people get out there and apply those skills sooner and in more diverse ways. Let me show you a couple of things quickly. These also, I think, is in your paper, so you probably can't read it that well. But in this 21st Century Skills report, you'll see a list of the skills. The AOL Time Warner Foundation recently paid for a poll, and they asked the public, oversampled teachers, oversampled business, it looks about the same, and they said, first, how important do you think these skills are? So that the darker lines, the taller, darker ones, are the percentage of folks that said very important, going from almost 100% for the core skills, reading, writing, and arithmetic, communication, adaptability to change, using technology, critical thinking, problem solving, collaboration, tolerance, global understanding, analyzing the media, creativity, contribution. So they go from virtually 100% down to about 65% in terms of folks saying that they're very important, the top one. Now, how many people said we think most young people today are learning these skills? Well, that's the next one. Even on our core skills, the public does not think most young people are learning what they need to be learning, and when you get away from the core ones, it gets down into almost nothing. There's an urgency in that graph. There's something there that we can use. Large numbers of the general public are giving us a basics plus set of skills that we want young people to learn. Large numbers are saying we don't think kids are learning those today. Where do they think they should be learning them? They think parents, they think K through 12 schools, they think higher education institutions have a role. Again, this was a survey done asking about teenagers, so that would come in there. And then they think religious institutions, places where teens have worked, after school and summer programs, sort of cluster in as another key place where we think these skills should be learning. There are lots of other questions. I encourage you to go to the website and look at it. I won't put the detail up, but the point is, I think we have a real window here to blur the lines, because we've got simultaneously a large mandate that says we want young people to be learning skills, but it's more than just reading, writing, and math, and it's more than just traditional academic content. We think after-school programs and summer jobs and things play a role, but we also think schools need to do this. And we know they're strapped, and we know they have demands on them, but we think somehow we need them to reprioritize what they do. So in some ways, we have to have a balance between seeing after-school programs as needing to put up a defense to not sort of cave in to the demands of education, but we can think about it going the other way. Increasingly, done well, and you've got people in this room who've done a masterful job at it, done well, these programs are becoming, at least at the school level, Trojan horses for bringing new ideas and innovation and new partnerships into the school to really help us not just blur the lines to make sure that kids are occupied more of the time, but also to really enhance learning and to do learning with incitement. So we've got opportunities to blur the lines, and we have them in lots of ways. Obviously, we can do more to both make sure that folks who are working in after-school and out-of-school programs have the curriculum and the instructional aids that they need to have. And again, one of the things that's coming out as we're doing research is a lot of people are just making it up. And we know enough to not have people just making it up. But that also requires that there's professional development, that there's training, and that there are resources for that. It also requires and gives us an opportunity to do content alignment, as I was talking about. And again, you've got an example in the paper of content alignment, where folks are really sitting down with the school district and figuring out how we make these connections happen. We can do this in a way, and as long as we're careful that when we align the content, we don't necessarily have to align the practice. I mean, we need to keep the practice diversified, but we can do more around content alignment. We're also doing more, obviously, just to create buildings where the lines are blurring, and the Coalition of Community Schools just put out a whole book on that called Making a Difference. Go to their website and look at it. And then clearly the last thing is that we can bridge staff. Now, it's clear that we can bridge staff at the building level. I also put into the paper an example of bridging staff at the system level, where you really can have staff people. There's an organization that's called, or a program called CS Squared, Communities for, what is it called now? Career Success, Community, put Career Success, Communities, and Schools in some order, and that's the name of it. And they're changing their name because it's hard to remember. But nonetheless, there's a program that is happening here in Massachusetts, so you should know about it, also being replicated in California, where at the district level, they're hiring people who are called social entrepreneurs, being paid part by the schools, part by private funding, and they are literally walking around blurring the lines. They are looking for learning opportunities in the community. They're figuring out how to get students in and out of them. They're bringing innovation into the schools. It's terrific, and I think it's actually written up in the newsletter that's out on the front table. So that's where we can go at a system level to not just make this happen classroom by classroom. I want to leave you with two final thoughts. And that's basically, and this comes out of work that we just did with Sam Piha over here in San Francisco. The idea that the other reason we can blur the lines is that the funding is blurred. So I just want to remind you, and this is data that's coming from San Francisco from their Department for Children, Youth, and Families that just looked across all the departments to ask where's money. You can't see it, it's a little bit blurred at the top. This is the pie chart when they asked districts, and this is a very important piece. We talked about evaluation. We can back up from evaluation at a policy level and talk about accountability. One way to get accountability is to ask, where is the money? Where is it? Where is it going? Who's doing what with it? In order to do that, we have to start being able to define outcomes from a young person's perspective, not from a system's perspective. They did this in San Francisco. So they asked a series of outcome questions related to academic support, and it didn't matter whether you were the health department, the recreation department, juvenile probation, or schools. They asked, do you do this? Do you have any programs that do this? If you do, tell us which program, tell us how much is in the budget, and answer some questions about it. So you're getting a database that's coming at this from a youth perspective. When they looked at that, they found that the Department for Children, Youth, and Families, which has money that comes from a children's fund, is funding a little more than a third of academic support programs. That the school district's funding about a quarter. Now that's after school, not during the school day. That the libraries are funding about 16%. That's the next largest one. And that the Department of Health Services, Human Services is funding about 9%. Parks and Rec about 7%. So you ask a question, who's doing one of these things, and you get an answer. And that's the picture of what it looks like when you ask the question about enrichment funding, quote unquote, which was a word. A little bit more coming from the Department of Youth Services. So from a policy perspective, it's important for us to come to some consensus about what the skills are that we want young people to be learning, where all the possible places are that they can learn them, what are all the possible ways that they can learn them, and then start to add up. Not just assume that if your schools, you're doing it this way, if you're after school, you're doing it this way, but start to add up. What does it look like? Who's doing it? Where is it happening? So that we can be accountable about where the dollars are flowing. And I will leave it with one more quote from Karen Walker that reminds us that, again, our job is to fill the white space, as we call it. Schools are clearly under the gun to show that kids are doing better academically, but many believe, including teachers and principals, that the function of after-school programs should be to provide activities that kids aren't getting elsewhere. So as we're looking to figure out how we blur the line, how we balance this equation of learning and relationships, of academic and non-academic, I encourage us to use our day and a half or day well. Thank you.
I just want to first thank Karen for her conceptualizing and pulling together many different strands of thinking. I also want to do a little advertisement for her that she will not feel as comfortable. She actually edited an issue in the journal New Directions for Youth Development called When, Where, What, and How Youth Learn, Blurring Schools and Community Boundaries, which I can recommend, although I'm an interested party because I'm the editor of the journal. But besides that, I'm really recommending it for the content and for her work. Now we would like to move to Ian Fordham. He's the Training and Professional Development Manager at Education Extra in the UK. In 5 years at Education Extra, he has written 2 training packs and delivered courses, seminars and workshops to lecturers, school principals, teachers, youth workers, and government officers. He's currently leading a government-funded program to integrate out-of-school learning into initial teacher training, which is very important, and certificate programs in universities for youth workers, also something that's very important that we all are trying to do here, and is co-writing a report which will lead to a new national accreditation framework for out-of-school learning. His paper is Bridging Learning Across the Pond. Now, this across the pond, I just want to say something about this for 1 second. I think in this country, we tend to focus on national issues, local and national issues. So we really think that when we have covered after-school issues, educational issues for this country, that we have done our job. And I think it's far too little of our time is spent figuring out best practices in other countries, and especially around this area of youth development and youth development in relationship to education. We will learn a lot. People will also look to us and are looking to us for innovation. But there's a lot there, and part of the reason why there's a lot there is that there's a long tradition. There are many, many years of work that have already been that people have had under their belt. But in addition to that, reform is often easier because it is the Ministry of Education of a whole country that actually sets policy. And so when a country or a government decides it wants change, it can legislate the change in very different ways than in this country. And so I think this is one of the kind of secrets, not the only one, but one of the secrets why there has been such dramatic change in England from which we can learn a great deal.
Thanks, Gil. I just want to check if everyone can hear me. Hi, thank you. It feels like I'm sort of one of these ladders where the ladder starts at the mayor and then goes to the president and then goes to Karen and then comes to me. So I feel it's a great opportunity to be here in Harvard and to talk about the work of Education Extra. But I think it's really important, I think, when you come to a new country to be really up to speed on all the latest developments. So the first thing I always do is switch on the TV. So now I feel very up to date on The Bachelor. And I think Bob is probably going to choose Misty. Really what I'm trying to do in 20 minutes is I guess quite ambitious in the sense that, I mean, obviously I've got to try and paint a picture of what's happening in the UK after school field. And that's a real challenge because I really will be skipping over a lot of the detail. A lot of the information is actually in the paper. I'm a little worried that I might be changing the world, as Bob was talking about before. I'm from a galaxy far, far away. It's 6.5-hour flights, and if you want to come over and see what we're doing, that'd be great. But I've got 5 key points that I want to try and get across, and I'll just mention them now. In the UK, we have a national framework for after school. And we've really, as an organisation, actually developed a new vocabulary around out-of-school hours. We've come up with an idea and a concept called study support. And at about 5 years ago, we actually created this kind of national framework document. And the real trick that we played, it was real subversion. It wasn't actually something which the government actually really realised what we were doing. We actually created a framework for after-school activities which linked it very much to raising achievement. But the trick that we played was that within the 3 circles, which I'll come back to a little bit later, we actually included a range of different activities. Extension activities, which, as Bob mentioned before, extend beyond the school day, enabling activities which are around developing key skills, and enrichment activities. So we developed this framework, and the government have accepted that all of these activities outside school hours raise achievement. We've won that battle. We've also developed other language as well, and we spent the evening last night at Harvard Faculty Club. It was very nice too. And I was talking about a phrase that we use, which is about built-in, not bolt-on. And that's an incredibly important phrase in the UK around after school, as in it links back into what's going on in learning inside the school, and it's not just a bolt-on extra. So that's the first point. Secondly, we've developed this conceptual framework for out-of-school hours, which is the 3 circles, or the 3 balls, depending on where you come from. And it's a range of concentric circles which actually gives us a framework for these activities. And just having a quick word with a few people before I spoke today, that 3 circles model seems to have quite a lot of currency over here, and it might be worth actually looking at that in terms of your own practice. We've also become very professionalised in terms of out-of-school hours. We have out-of-school hours coordinators in probably about 40% of schools in the UK. We have out-of-school coordinators at local government level who plan strategically what's happening in terms of after-school. We also have professional youth workers. So we have youth workers who have degrees, postgraduate qualifications, master's qualifications. And I was mentioning to Karen just before, who's actually visited the UK, they've just developed a new MBA for youth work managers at senior level as well. And it's that kind of professionalism which allows us to make those links across the professions. In my paper, I talk a lot about national and local bridging. And one of the national bridges that we made is obviously making the study support this idea and a concept, which has actually allowed us to expand out-of-school hours activities across the piece. But we've also managed to do other things as well, again, mostly by subversion, actually, rather than anything else. We've actually stimulated a research project, a research report called The Impact of Study Support, which is basically determined the focus of what a number of schools do, but it actually makes the case that out-of-school hours activities genuinely impact upon in-school achievement. And the minister essentially said and turned around to us and said, well, you've made that case, we don't need to know about that anymore. And I know that's a very different situation than it is in the US. After school is also inspected in the UK as well, which is an incredibly challenging issue for us. We have an inspection framework, an organisation called the Office for Standards in Education, or Ofsted, who actually inspect the quality of teaching and learning in schools. But after school is actually an integral part of that. And that is, in some ways, a challenge, in the sense that schools are feeling that they're being inspected on the quality of what they do after school. But for some schools that are actually in disadvantaged areas or challenging areas, they've actually used that as a positive development. So they've actually used the after-school and the benefits that are happening in the after-school area to actually move them forward. And in some ways, the inspectors actually turn around and say, well, the after-school stuff is great, continue doing that kind of work, and then try and link it back into what's going on in in-school achievement. We're also, as an organisation, we're just about to take on the technical assistance role for full-service schools. And again, I was talking last night about after-school and where we see it going in the UK. Well, one small aspect of it is that people have turned around and they've said, after school is that first bridge to full-service schooling. And for many schools, and we're talking about small schools, rural schools, large public or high schools, for some schools who haven't opened their doors to the community, out of school hours is the first step towards that full service schooling model. That's not necessarily where we see after school going, but it's one piece of the jigsaw. And finally, out of school hours learning is being used as a vehicle to deliver other policies as well. And this is a very recent development for us, but we are seeing a number of different policy areas such as health, regeneration, crime and youth justice actually using after school as a vehicle to deliver their policies, because there's a lot more freedom in the after school arena than there is in school. In some ways that could be seen as a threat to after school, but we actually see it as a genuine move forward, because it actually for schools means a diversity of funding streams that Karen talked about. Schools are actually able to actually tap into a range of funding streams in terms of their after school programs that they could never do before. So we see it as a positive movement. And just to give you a barometer of where we are, last year, I believe is it Rod Page who's the head of Department of Education? Well, our Rod Page is a lady called Estelle Morris. And last year in a conference she said, "We're beginning to learn that it isn't just about knowing that out-of-school hours learning matters, it actually has a hugely positive and conscious link back into what goes on in mainstream classrooms. In my mind, I'd moved from a compensatory education model to realising that a vision of education and a vision of educational achievement meant that out-of-school hours activities could be at the core of learning. It's an inseparable part of what actually goes on during the school day, and because we know that out-of-school hours learning works, we can have a different vision of what schools might be, and we could define learning in a way that we had not been able to do before." Now, with that kind of support, obviously after school is moving at a great pace. So we feel in a very fortunate position. But what I'm not going to do today is actually evangelise about the UK. What I'm going to try to do is to sort of skate over some of the issues that we've actually talked about in the paper, and hopefully for you to see some kind of resonance in your own situation. And I know that you're on, I use the analogy of being on the after-school train, where there are some people who are actually driving the train forward. There are some people who are travelling in first class, quite happily, very comfortable. Some people who are travelling in economy class. Some people who are sitting on the platform waiting for the train to come. And some people who don't know the train exists at all. Now, I know that there are lots of people in this room who are at various stages in terms of after school, but I think that what we're trying to say is that there's a range of different issues which I hope that people can actually learn from in terms of the work that we're doing in the UK. Very quickly, what I'm going to try and do is set a little bit of the context to this, because I think a lot of what I've been saying so far doesn't actually have a lot of resonance until you know what situation we are in terms of the UK. And then I'll go and speak a little bit more about some of the key issues which I've raised already. Incidentally, as you can imagine, I was quite nervous about this, doing this speech, and I actually asked my organisation, Education Extra, to say whether they can actually contribute something and give me something which is support me. So instead of actually rallying around and finding all the kind of key research reports, they gave me this dog. So that's going to just sit down by the side of me here as a little comfort. What I'm also going to talk about is also what's not in the paper. Because, as you'd imagine, in terms of the UK after-school field, there are so many different things that are going on that I'm just going to try and sort of really try and signpost you to some of those resources. And what you'll see in the paper, there's a whole wealth of resources and websites and so on for you to actually look at those. So, again, I'm going to try and touch on those towards the end. I hope you can see this. But I just sort of reflect really on sort of Gil's notion really of having an important day and going away with some really important learnings.
That's exactly what I meant.
Exactly. So a little bit about Education Extra. We're a charity that we're not-for-profit organisation that were founded in 1992. And we were set up by a guy called Lord Young, who unfortunately has now passed away. But he actually wrote the post-war education manifesto for the Labour Party handwritten. And then he set up a range of organisations which include Education Extra. We are not a membership organisation, we're an enabling organisation. We've got a network of 11,000 schools, which is around about a third of all schools in the UK. And really we're kind of like an advocacy organisation that share good practice. We run training courses, we produce publications, some of which are outside. But we also work UK-wide as well, and that's really the challenge, particularly because we're not just talking about an amorphous sort of blob. We're talking about 4 separate countries with 4 separate cultures, and trying to understand the after-school situation sort of is embedded within that. So just to give you a bit of a snapshot of the UK, for some people this will be, you've visited the UK and so on, but just to give you an idea, 4 countries. It's the 4th largest economy in the world. And our favourite food is curry. It's true. It is absolutely true. But just to give you an idea of the scale, and this is where it starts to get a little bit more kind of, hopefully it sort of allows you to see the kind of operation that we're actually working on here. We're looking really in terms of England particularly, and I'll talk a lot about England. But we've obviously got the 4 countries that are actually managed and are now being devolved. So we have devolved power to all the 4 countries, yet there is still a lot of central government power divested in Whitehall in London. What you'll see as well, interestingly enough, and I'll just show you the next slide, is that the UK education system is also managed in a devolved way as well. So we're not only working with one Department of Education, we're working with 4. We're also working with the Northern Ireland Assembly, which has been formed and reformed and formed and reformed for obvious reasons. But that, is incredibly important. And if you really want to look at some of the issues that we're looking at in terms of Northern Ireland, after school, outreach work in the community, and we're doing a fantastic amount of work in Northern Ireland. And again, it'd be great if people want to come out and have a look at some of that work. But we, again, report to, there's a lot of acronyms there, Department for Education and Skills, there's a National Education Department in Wales, Scottish Education Executive, and the Department of Education in Northern Ireland. And we work through those structures. In terms of after school, and I just look at England in particular, we have a Department for Education and Skills rather than Department of Education. And within that, the after school field starts to break up. However, what you'll see is that it's actually starting to join up a little bit. We have a new Children and Families division, which looks at out-of-school childcare, what you call school-age childcare, the full-service schools policy, that comes under a new cross-cutting Children and Families division. We have a schools directorate, which looks at out-of-school hours learning, which is mainly our area of work. But we also have the lifelong learning division, which actually looks at youth work. And the connection service, which you'll find out a little bit if you look at the paper, is a new one-stop service for young people. And as you probably know, as I say before, the youth work is professionalised in the UK. So there's an enormous number of connections there, but it's actually retained under one roof. So it's quite a different way of approaching it. How that reflects what happens in the US, I'm not too sure. In terms of how we actually work, we work through 354 local authorities in England. That's the kind of the regional bodies. And to give you an idea, there's around about 500 to 1,000 schools within each of those local authorities. But we also do that UK-wide as well. So each of those schools manages things like that, equivalent to school districts, that sort of size. But we actually work through them, and each of those people has an out-of-school hours coordinator. So we actually do a lot of our networking work through those people. If you know all this, I do apologise, as I say, because it's just trying to give you an idea of how it all fits together. And just to give you an idea, somebody said to me yesterday about things like ethnicity and race and poverty and so on. You don't get that kind of thing in the UK, do you? And it just struck me, and it was a very innocent comment, but I think that just to give you an idea of some of the kind of statistics there, there's a huge amount of poverty in the UK. There's a lot of rural poverty. There's a lot of people who are disengaged from learning. There are a lot of young people who are suffering from disaffection. I'll show you the 3 E's in a minute, but we also have the 3 D's, which is about being disappointed, disaffected, and disappeared. And we have a lot of those kids as well, and those are the kinds of kids that we're trying to attract. And very much Education Extra's work is in the 88 most deprived areas in the UK. So that's the kind of focus, that's where we're coming from. When I came last year, I met with a fantastic woman, Ellen Gannett, who I know is based quite locally at Wellesley, who actually kind of came up with this idea about the US after-school field. And how that reflects to what's going on now, I don't know. However, the broad sort of distinctions between youth development, school-age childcare, and extended enrichment education does actually reflect quite nicely what happens in the UK. Yet it's where the blurring of the lines between those areas is the most interesting in the UK. What we're seeing is that actually those lines are starting to disappear, and that youth workers, after-school practitioners, and childcare workers are actually working much more in an integrated way. So this is the UK. As I say, we have professional youth workers who are working in schools, and there's also in after-school settings as well. And in the paper I mentioned some work that we've been doing with the National Youth Agency, who are a national organisation who are responsible for these youth workers, who've actually looked at the issue of youth work and out-of-school hours and how to work sort of effectively together and to kind of bridge those boundaries between the two professions. And there's some real challenges there about definitions of learning, definitions of outcomes, but what we're looking at here is the after-school field is actually moving on, and we're saying integration of these different members of staff. And my training and professional development is often done in mixed groups. So it's not done just with principals or with teachers, it's done with teachers, with youth workers, with childcare workers and so on. That's the way we're moving. Out-of-school hours learning is the kind of phrase which we use, and we've always had a problem with this because it defines something which it isn't. And we've always tried to come up with a different phrase, but we've always struggled. But the way the agenda's moving is certainly that we use out-of-school hours learning at the same time as study support. And this is where the trick comes in, because the government have accepted the term study support as linking into achievement. Teachers don't like it, schools don't like it, because it sounds very narrow, it sounds very academic. But we've drawn it out to be so broad to integrate in enrichment activities and extension activities as well, and the government just didn't realise what they were doing and signing up to. So it's part of the charge really is to identify how you, at national policy level, at local policy level, can actually utilise some of this work that we've actually sort of defined the field in a slightly different way. So very quickly, just looking through the paper, I described that sort of an educational revolution's taken place in the last 20 years in the UK, and that's very much the case because we've had particularly a very kind of happy, content sort of political climate. We have a Labour Party, a very kind of quite left-wing that's now very centrist, standing shoulder to shoulder with our friends over here. But interestingly enough, the after-school movement has really developed at such a pace because of that, because there's an idea about tackling social exclusion, about providing a range of opportunities for the most disadvantaged and disaffected young people, and it's very much a kind of a social agenda. Out-of-school hours learning is a key policy in all 4 countries. I quote particularly in Wales where they want, and it's in a national education document which says they want an entitlement for all young people to have a full prospectus of out-of-school hours activities by 2010. So now we have to deliver it. There's also the issue about intervention, and we have a range of initiatives that go on in the most disadvantaged areas in the UK. I mentioned Excellence in Cities, which has a number of different strands to it. One of them particularly is around learning mentors. So learning mentors that work in an after-school setting, but also in an in-school setting to raise people's achievement, but also to raise their motivation and self-esteem and confidence as well. And that's had a huge impact upon inner-city schools in particular. And this idea about joined-up thinking. And when I mentioned joined-up thinking last year, people were like, huh? What joined-up thinking? But the whole idea is about cross-cutting government departments that actually have a brief to look at children and young people's welfare. And this is a real move forward in the government. And obviously there are some tensions there because there's turf issues between different groups of staff, between different departments. But these cross-cutting government departments have made a huge impact in terms of our own work. And just to give you an idea about that, this will be a load of gobbledygook for quite a lot of people here. But in the year 2000, we had a number of reports written by all government departments on the topic of social exclusion. So every single government department had to produce a report which was all funded, which was all action plan, all particular outcomes, look for it. And within each of those government departments, every single one was looking at tackling this issue of social exclusion. And throughout each of the reports, there's mention of after-school activities, as you would expect. So, for example, just go from the top left, just pick out a couple. Jobs for All, that's the Department for Work and Pensions. Initiatives to tackle financial exclusion, that's the Treasury. Neighbourhood wardens, the Home Office, they're the people who deal with crime and youth justice. Antisocial behaviour. Arts and sports, we have a huge programme around arts and sports and after-school activities in the UK. I mentioned to one of the delegation here about a programme we've got called Playing for Success, which locates after-school programmes within the national sporting grounds and arenas in the UK. Huge, massive amounts of impact on academic achievement, but in terms of self-esteem and confidence, they also measure that as well. It's an incredibly sort of innovative programme. And when I mentioned that last year, a lot of people going, "Ooh, that sounds interesting." And things like even closing the digital divide. But all of these reports have actually then informed policy. Our one particularly is around Schools Plus, which actually looks at extended schools and full service schools as well. I hope this is all making sense, and you're looking at me like, oh, what? So I'll go and have a look at, in terms of national bridging. Really, the ideas, the kind of key ideas, is this idea around study support, and trying to understand that we've actually have a framework which is essentially conceived as a national framework for pupil motivation, and then turned into the national framework for out-of-school hours. And the great thing about it is that all schools are signed up to it, and all the national partner organisations are signed up to it. And how you would do that over here, either at a statewide level or national level, is, I think, perhaps something which, which may be discussed. But having some kind of touchstone for all schools, for all after-school organisations to actually link back to, a common agenda, a common language, has been very important for us. It's a very inclusive term, as I've said, including many activities, and that's been the greatest thing about it, because we trick the government into believing that all these activities actually link into achievement, and we know that's the case. We basically proved it in retrospect. And some of the fantastic research that's come out in the States, which actually proves the academic achievement of after-school programs, and that's where you're streets ahead of us in terms of evaluation, in terms of that kind of work. I believe you're streets ahead of the UK. We might be streets ahead in other areas, but that's for discussion. We've won the argument in terms of it raising achievement. We don't have to prove that anymore. The ministers turn around to us all the time and say, look, you don't have to tell us that it actually makes a difference. We know it makes a difference. What you have to do is to say why it makes a difference, to whom it makes a difference. And one of the quotes I use in there is around, there's a niceness to what we do. There's it's all nice, it's cuddly, it's lovely. But try and identify those particular outcomes that actually make a huge difference. Kill those programs that don't work. Reinvent it. And one great phrase which one of our trustees used, which is around not reinventing the wheel, but reimagining the wheel. So it's a great idea. You don't have to reinvent it. It's used within the inspection framework, and I can sort of point you to different documents where it's actually shown. As I said, and for a lot of inner city schools, if they're failing, and failing schools just get shut down, after school is often the bit which is actually keeping them afloat. So they're building on what happens after school, and then that's making a huge difference for principals particularly, selling them the argument that community involvement, that after-school programs is actually making a huge difference to their program, to their, to their local school, to the local community, to parents and so on, is actually making a massive difference. There are problems with the term study support. It sounds very academic, but in countries like Scotland, that's actually been transformed. Because it links so clearly with academic achievement, they can argue for more money. They can say, look, the arguments are won. We want more money for this because it makes a difference. It's called study support. It links to the curriculum. But what they don't tell them is all the other enrichment activities that are going on as well. We also have government funding as well through the lottery, which has made an enormous difference. In the last 4 or 5 years, we've had around about $300 million put into schools and partnership organisations through the National Lottery. It's called the New Opportunities Fund, and there are a number of good causes, one of which is education, and one strand is out-of-school hours learning. And schools have real freedom in terms of what they do, innovative learning activities outside school hours. There's a lot of paperwork attached to it, so that might be something, if you wanted to adopt it over here, to kill the amount of paperwork that goes on. But we also have central government funding as well. This year it's about $80 million, which goes directly into school budgets for out-of-school hours activities. There is no reporting back. The out-of-school hours learning framework, very, very quickly, because I know that I'm probably running out of time. We've used it as a conceptual framework to define learning outside school hours. And this is very much school-linked out-of-school hours learning. That's how we use the framework. What we found, and I'll just show it to you. I hope you can see it. And this is within the study support framework. This is within the national framework document. This is published by the government. It changes a little bit depending on where you go. So you have Scottish country dancing if it's for a Scottish audience, and you have the Ceilidh for an Irish audience, and so on. But what we see the way in which learning is actually connecting to various aspects of the curriculum, but it all links back to raising achievement. And it's been an incredibly powerful model. It's a great training tool, because you can identify from a program point of view, well, what aspects are you doing, what aspects are you not including. I do a lot of training work with principals who are just looking at actually auditing what they do. How can you provide more enrichment activities to look at targeting more disaffected pupils? Are you providing, because most schools in England do a lot of extension activities, traditional extracurricular activities, but it's the other enrichment side that we're actually looking at, because we're saying the government has accepted this actually makes a difference. I'm not going to say anything more about that. It's just something to ponder and something to think about and something to reflect. I mean, Gil's quite excited about this. He was quite, we're getting really excited. And saying that this might be a way of redefining learning across the after-school field in the US. Wonderful if that's the case. Absolutely wonderful if that's the case. But it's an incredibly valuable tool for us in the UK as a way of explaining what takes place outside school hours. It's all linked to learning. And we've actually used that quite a lot in terms of different groups of staff as well. So youth workers, childcare workers, saying that actually what you're doing is you're actually all doing learning. And how you actually integrate that at a school level or in a youth setting or whatever is perhaps something for discussion. Right, very, very quickly. We produced a guy called Professor John Macbeth, who's now at University of Cambridge, produced a 3-year longitudinal qualitative and quantitative research report called The Impact of Study Support. All I need to tell you is that it proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that out-of-school hours learning makes a difference. And we had real problems about it because we thought, God, is the methodology a bit suspect? You know, when you look at all the figures and so on, I mean, does it all add up? And some of the schools dropped out and everything else. What the government wanted was a report done by somebody important to say, right, there you go. And I know that's it's a very throwaway comment, but in a sense, that's what really they were looking for. They wanted some way of turning around to the Treasury. It's Gordon Brown, he's a Scottish guy, he's very frugal with his money. And saying this actually makes a difference. Here's a research report that actually shows that to be the case. Out-of-school hours learning as a vehicle, this is something that's just really happening in the last couple of months for us, is we're being asked by the central government, who actually have an out-of-school hours learning team within the central government, who are turning around to us and saying, right, we'd like to use out-of-school hours learning to deliver a range of other policies. And the example I use is a program called Food in Schools. And Food in Schools is a Department of Health and a Department of Education initiative, jointly together funded, to provide out-of-school hours activities linked to health, linked to nutrition. So we're providing breakfast clubs, of which we run a large program in the UK, which is funded by Kellogg's, which is continuing at a great pace at the moment. And we also run bucket clubs, which is the reading, essentially enjoyment of reading, that sort of thing. So now we also run cook-it clubs, which are the out-of-school hours cookery clubs. And strangely enough, the participation from boys, and particular groups, is really fascinating. So that's the program we're running at the moment. Some people said to me, and I think it was Lisa and Jodie, who were saying, oh, God, is this going to be a threat to after school? I actually argue the contrary, in fact. How after school is moving in the UK, it's becoming more integrated, and also it's becoming more diffused. If it crosses across other government departments, it actually sustains the longevity of the policy. It actually opens up different funding streams for schools, for youth settings, for other organisations as well, who can tap into a variety of different policies and funding streams. It also means that we're known as well as an organisation, and the policy is known, and it starts to become embedded. It's built in, not bolt on. And finally, in terms of local bridging, I just mentioned 3 things. Training and professional development. We have a national training and professional development programme. It was called Building Effective Study Support. We had around about 40 seminars running each year in regional areas, clusters of schools, clusters of outside partner organisations working together. It's an online network. It's about seminars. It's about encouraging this kind of discussion and talking, bringing in interesting people to talk to people about learning, about health and safety, about some of the key issues. That's also going to be running in the next couple of years as well. Youth work, as I mentioned before, it's a profession. We've been trying to bridge across the professions between groups of school staff and youth working staff. Youth workers who turn around and say, well, teachers don't know anything about learning, or young people, and vice versa. And trying to bridge that gap between the two, and we produced a great report which hasn't got a lot of circulation, and a code of practice for youth work and after school, which has been published in the UK. And finally, full service extended schools, an idea stolen from the United States and reinvented for the UK. And within all 4 countries in the UK, we have a different policy. Extended schools in England, new community schools in Scotland, community-focused schools in Wales, and communities in schools in Northern Ireland. And they will have completely different focus, but in new community schools in Scotland, every school in Scotland is funded to provide a full-service extended school. That's their vision of schooling for the future. Things I couldn't say. I'm sorry, I'm sure I've probably gone over time. We have a National College for School Leadership, which is a head teachers college, which has an incredibly national importance. It has a new community leadership program, which is being accredited for principals, and also a program called Leading from the Middle, which is about school leaders and middle managers who are important in delivering after-school programs. I run a program called Out-of-School Hours Learning within Initial Teacher Training. I train newly qualified teachers and teachers who are about to become newly qualified and get them skilled up about after-school. In Northern Ireland, we're doing lots of conflict resolution work. Playing for Success, I've mentioned, which is a sports program. And also, when I come back to the UK on 14th of October, we're merging with another organisation called the Community Education Development Centre, and we're going to create a new organisation with a new name. I can't tell you what it is because it's secret. But the interesting thing about that, and might give you an idea in terms of the future of after school in the States, is that we have an education directorate, we have a regeneration directorate, and we have a health directorate. And they integrate in terms of these issues to do with after school, to do with full service schooling, because the person who's responsible for health and regeneration turns around to me and says, well, schools aren't the only site for learning. And from a school person, this is incredible, this is fantastic, I've never heard this before. But for a lot of us, it's actually transforming the way we look at learning and looking at lifelong learning and seeing that it's not just about the school, not linked to the school-linked after-school programs, it's actually much broader than that. Two final thoughts. Our organisation was set up and we run essentially by our director called Kay Andrews, who, by the wonderful, fantastic, brilliant system in the UK, because obviously we have baronesses and lords. She's now a baroness in the House of Lords. She talks about finding the unicyclist in every child. It's about excitement of learning, it's about enjoyment of learning, and moving ourselves perhaps away from the academic achievement agenda, or perhaps an inclusive learning framework, or perhaps around these three circles, and talking about things in a slightly different way. And finally, my favourite quote. We've done things in the UK very much by retrospective design rather than actually by, long-term thinking. What I really hope that is achieved by today is actually that people take and dip into different aspects of the things that we're doing in the UK, perhaps finding out a little bit more about the work that we do, perhaps actually trying to set up some kind of links between the work that we do in the UK. I'm really, really grateful for you to listen to what I say, and also obviously the dog's very grateful as well, so thank you very much.
Well, I promised you two wonderful papers, and I think I kept the promise. Let's take a break and come back.